Probably about 5 years ago, we became just interested in tiny houses. It wasn't that much of a movement so much back then, or a trend. We just always lived simply, so we were looking for how we might live simply in our next iteration of doing that. And about 3 years ago, we got to the point where we felt like I was working too much. I was working about 60 to 80 hours a week, and that wasn't we weren't living our priorities or our values as much as we wanted to be. So we wanted to put our relationships to family and friends in the natural world back into the center. And one way of doing that was to have really low overhead expenses every month so that I could work part-time and we can open up that space. And so we'd been to California, we rented one for a while just to make sure that it was going to work for us. We started to look more seriously at building a tiny house and eventually ended up deciding to do it. We didn't build it, we designed it with our builder, and then our builder actually built it for us. Well, he's really, he's an artist really, and we feel like we live within a big piece of artwork.
Seeing the tumbleweed homes and the beauty of them combined with the practicality was one of the things that really started us thinking, oh, well, we might be able to do this. And we'd lived tiny a lot before. We lived in tents, and we lived in 12 by 12 and small cabins. And we wanted that same kind of experience, but instead of being totally off the grid, we wanted to be able to have really good light in our house. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want to carry our water. We wanted to be able to turn on the faucet. And we seem to move around a lot. And the other thing about tiny houses on wheels is that it gives you that option.
We've lived off-grid quite a lot in our lives, and when we were thinking about how to design tiny, we're really trying to think about who we are now, rather than who we were 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, and what are our current needs, and what's realistic in terms of us staying in tiny long term. Mm-hmm. And so, right now we actually are set up so that we're connected to septic and a well, and that's what works for us right now. There was a time in our lives where we would have wanted to have every single sustainable technology possible, and there's still a large part of us that would like to incorporate more sustainable technologies, but at this point in time it also felt like moving into 175 square feet was probably a pretty big sustainability move in and of itself. Our tiny house is 25 feet long by 8.5 feet wide, which is the maximum width you can have and pull it yourself, by 13.5 feet high, which is the maximum height that you can pull on a road. And we're on a 3-axle trailer. Each axle can hold 6,000 pounds, and it turns out that tiny actually weighs 14,000 pounds, so we had plenty of weight to play with. Probably the most unique part of our design is our Doggie Elevator, and that has to do with our soon-to-be 10-year-old Corgi. His birthday is on Monday. Yeah. And he has just always slept on our bed. And originally we thought, well, he's only 9.5, we can retrain him to sleep downstairs. And we sat with that for about 2 weeks, and we thought, no, it's not about him, it's about us. Yeah. And we really want him to be with us. And we did design stairs up to our main loft because I tend to use the washroom at night, and I didn't want to be climbing down a ladder, but they're a little bit steep for him, and he has a little bit of a bad back. So Matt, our builder, is fantastic, and he stared into open space for a long time, and then he eventually came up with this idea for a Doggie Elevator. It's on a winch that pulls up an anchor, essentially, and so Shanti steps into it, gets out on the bed, and gets to sleep with us. One thing to think about living in a tiny home, and it's a totally different one to actually experience it. So we wanted to experience it. And the one that we were in didn't have very much storage. And even though we knew that we were going to give away a lot of what we owned, we still were going to need some storage. And so we have lots of little nookie places where we have storage built into our stairs, underneath the fireplace, underneath the couch. We have toe kick drawers in the kitchen, really anywhere where there is any potential extra space. we built in storage.
I think we didn't want to lose the richness of our lives. We wanted to bring with us the kinds of things that are important to us. So we have a place for some of my family's dishes from like the 1800s, which I thought I was going to have to give up. But as we did the design, it turned out that there were little places for that. And we have art supplies because we like to do things like visual journaling, and we knit. So we have a place for yarn.
Yeah, and we did a lot of repurposing. So we had a dresser drawer that was a little bit broken, and it turned into our bathroom cabinet and shelving. We did as much local as we could, so most of the wood, not all of it, most of it is local. The beauty, I think, was important to us. We didn't want to feel like we were living in a cabin, not that there's anything wrong with that, but we wanted to feel like we were living in a real home.
For people who are thinking about tiny homes, I think that living in it for a while, like we were talking about earlier, and really thinking about who you are and what you value, and not in a superficial way, but in a really deep way.
Yeah, really designing it for your own needs. So the kitchen was really important to us. We have a full-size fridge, which many tiny homes don't have.
Some people don't have ovens. We wanted an oven. Why do we want an oven?
French
because
fries.
we make French fries.
French fries are our junk food, so we had to have an oven. Yeah. Also, I have chemical sensitivities, so we were really careful with making sure that air was going to circulate well. We do have an HRV, which was a bit of an expense. It's like a human nose. In fact, we call it Tiny's nose. Essentially, it expels used up air while holding on to about 80 to 85% of the heat from that air, and then it brings in cool air from the outside, preheats it, and brings it in. So there's always circulation. We were also really careful about materials. So I slept with a lot of materials for a couple of weeks to make sure that nothing was going to off gas, and which of course brought up the expense. The plywood, for example, any plywood on the inside of the house is formaldehyde free.
Okay.
Whereas on the outside, it's fine, but that plywood costs 4 times as much here as it does the regular plywood. So, there were compromises in that we made along the way too, but never in relationship to our health. We have 17 windows, so lots of natural light, which also means that we need to work a little bit with it not getting too hot in here in the summertime, and also having not too much heat escape via the windows in the wintertime, and that's something that we're still really experimenting with and figuring out for ourselves. Mostly we came up against minimum size limits. Part of the challenge in Cape Breton anyways is that a tiny house isn't a designation in any kind of codes or anything. And so after a lot of conversation with the city planner, we came to an understanding that we were designated as a travel trailer, which meant that we could live anywhere we could live rurally. We couldn't live in the city, but we didn't want to anyways. And we could live in places that were not designated as a rural residential subdivision. Other than in those places we could live. And as long as we were connected to septic. So even if we had a composting toilet, it wouldn't have mattered for the gray water. We would have needed to be connected to septic. We found this piece of land, which was for sale at the time, and we couldn't afford it. But we contacted the owners and we said, well, how about we pay you a little bit of rent per month, and that'll pay your taxes until it sells, and then we'll figure it out from there. And so we went to the planning folks, and they said, that's fine, you're only there temporarily because you're renting, and there used to be a mobile home here, so there was already a well and a septic in place. So we really put a little bit more gravel down on the pad, but essentially we drove in and connected to systems. It was really important to me that we were set up in a legal way. We had read a number of blogs about tiny housers who were sort of hidden off into the bush, and good for them. Totally support that too. We read this one blog about somebody who'd been living in Iowa City or something, pretty much illegally for 6 years.
Wow.
And nobody had ever asked him to leave, but it just got more and more stressful for him, knowing that somebody could ask him, and he found that he was hiding himself, and eventually he chose to leave on his own. So we wanted to be legal because we feel like part of our living tiny is to help people understand that you can live a different lifestyle. And we don't have any expectation that people would live in 175 square feet, but maybe by our living in that size, somebody who's living in 2,000 square feet might be able to see, oh, I could live in 1,000 or 800 or 600. So we're hoping to inspire people to live smaller, though not necessarily tiny.
I also think that being legal was important to you because we want to educate.
Exactly.
And what happens when you are stuck away and nobody knows you're there is that nothing changes.
Right.
And while we're not out working in education actively as teachers, we want our lifestyle to be teaching.
Yeah, I don't think this is a caution so much as just something that we're encountering and still trying to figure out how to work best with, and that's high humidity levels. So we are well practiced that whenever we're in the bathroom, the fan is on, and whenever we're doing anything in the kitchen, even if it's just boiling water, our hood fan is on. So, and we have an HRV that we don't use in the summertime, but in the wintertime the air is circulating. And yet our humidity levels are incredibly high, and it's really all because of two people and a dog breathing. And in the summertime and in the spring, it doesn't seem to be that much of an issue. Whereas in the wintertime, we found a little bit of mold in a couple of places where the floor meets the wall, in areas where there's extra metal on the trailer, so the wheel wells, for example. And so it was just a little bit colder there, and the humidity was condensing in that area, which then started to create a little bit of mold. So we posted on a Tiny House Facebook page and just asked, has anybody else had this issue? What are you doing? And we got over 150 responses. And apparently people had been experiencing but just not talking about it much for some reason. And off of it, another tiny house builder wrote a really nice article actually bringing together. He showed a picture which looked of what had happened in his house. It looked exactly like our wall, really. So, and brought together some nice potential things to try, all of which we have tried, and it hasn't reduced our humidity. But part of it is that we live in a very humid area, and so in terms of living in Eastern Canada is probably just something that you need to deal with as best as you can. And I'm not sure it's something that we're going to resolve, so to speak, but it's still part of our adventure.
Well, the other thing that was interesting was as we started to look at how do you deal with moisture and mold issues, we thought it was a tiny house issue, and we discovered that it's an issue for people in big houses too. And
in areas that are high in humidity, one of the responses to us when we posted on the Facebook Tiny House page, what do you do with high humidity levels, was somebody from, I think was maybe living in Ontario, but was from Germany. I don't remember, but her solution was called luften, and it was basically a process that you do in Germany where you, depending on the month and how cold it is relative to the humidity, you open all your windows for a certain amount of time, several times a day, and you just exchange the air. Now we have an HRV, so the air is exchanging anyways, but in the winter time we ended up opening our windows for 3 to 5 minutes 2 or 3 times a day, and it did help bring down the humidity. So we weren't able to find insurance for the actual moving of Tiny. So it might be out there, we just weren't able to find it. Which is why we decided, since it wasn't a very long move, we actually hired a tow company, and they're insuring whatever they're towing. Right. So Tiny was insured in that sense. And then in terms of actually insuring Tiny as a home, again, tiny houses don't exist on insurance people's screens. And so we're actually insured as a mini home. And to be a mini home, we had to skirt Tiny, so you can't actually see her wheels right now, but they're there. And we had to tie her down, which means that she has 4 pieces of rebar that are going down into the ground. So we're not just going to go up and drive away in the middle of the night. We're hoping that tiny houses become a little bit more common so that house insurance becomes a little bit cheaper, because again, they've never heard of a tiny house. But there was actually only one company of all the companies that our friend explored, who's an insurance broker, that would even attempt to insure us. So we were incredibly grateful that somebody would.
I think a lot of people got themselves in pretty deep with home ownership. Big homes take a lot of money to keep up and a lot of life energy. And I think that people have started to rethink the big house and big expensive life. And somebody was pretty smart and began to publicize tiny houses. And I also think because, and Tumbleweed was one of the first people to do that, because what they were presenting felt like a house, people who maybe wouldn't have considered, whatever you want to call that, cabin living, said, oh, I could live in that, that's beautiful. And it has everything that I need. I think that's one of the reasons that it's been attractive. It's like almost like a pendulum where people lived in sort of normal size houses, smaller houses, 1,000 square feet. And then they went to these massive
McMansions.
And I think the pendulum is still swinging. We just read a really interesting thing that said that it might be that the most efficient size in terms of how much it costs to build and to live in is around 500 square feet, which I thought was interesting data that wasn't even around before the tiny house movement.
I think tiny houses right now are mostly attractive to two segments of the population, I'd say, and we actually kind of aren't in either, but so a slightly younger segment of population where real estate prices are just way too high and their salaries aren't you can't do it. And also very much to a retirement population. You know, I've met a number of people that are afraid to leave their work. They're afraid to retire because they don't think they'll be able to afford their lifestyles, and they probably, many of them won't be able to, but they could afford to be in a tiny house and still live in a beautiful space and do what they want to be doing with their lives. You know, in terms of the future, I don't think it's the be-all and end-all solution to the housing crisis at all. It's a solution for some people. I think tiny houses are being used in some good ways in the U.S. in particular in terms of homelessness. There's some really interesting projects happening down there. How it will evolve, you know, I think a lot of that will depend on how zoning and regulations evolve.